History loves to pretend it's run by great men with great plans. It isn't. It's run by typos, bad weather, hurt feelings, and guys who really should have quit while they were ahead. Here are 10 tiny mistakes that redrew the map of the world, and the fools who made them. Let's start with the world's most dangerous edit job. It's July 1870 in a German spa town called Bad Ems. The kind of place where old men go to soak their gout in warm water and pretend it's a personality. The King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, is strolling the promenade when the French ambassador, a nervous fellow named Benedetti, corners him with a demand. France is spooked that a German prince might grab the empty Spanish throne, so Benedetti wants the king to promise, forever, pinky swear, that it'll never, ever happen again. Wilhelm, being a polite old monarch, basically says, "Yeah, no, I'm not signing that, but let's keep this friendly." Crisis practically over. Everybody goes home. Nobody dies. Boring, right? Enter Otto von Bismarck, Prussia's chancellor, professional schemer, and a man who wanted a war the way you want your morning coffee. Wilhelm sends him a telegram summarizing the polite little chat. And Bismarck, sitting at dinner, picks up his pen and does the 19th century version of screenshotting a text and cropping out the part that makes you look reasonable. He snips the king's courtesy. He trims the warmth. He sharpens the whole thing into a blunt, icy slap. Then he leaks it to the newspapers. In his own words, he wanted it to work like a red rag on the Gallic bull. Spoiler, the bull charged. To the French, the edited version read like their ambassador had been humiliated and thrown out on his ear. National honor! Outrage! Mustaches trembling all across Paris. 6 days later, France proudly declares war and marches straight to its own funeral. Within weeks, the Prussians trap the French army at Sedan, capture Emperor Napoleon III himself, and keep rolling all the way to the gates of Paris. And the punchline? In January 1871, the German states crown their brand new Kaiser in the Hall of Mirrors. Inside Versailles, inside France, rubbing salt in the wound with a smile. A new empire, the most powerful on the continent, born not from some grand battle plan, but from a chancellor with a pair of scissors and a mean streak. One man edited one telegram over dinner. 40 years later, the country he built would drag the whole planet into the First World War. Autocorrect has nothing on Otto. Every family has that one relative who sells something priceless at a garage sale for pocket change and then spends the rest of their life refusing to talk about it. For Russia, that garage sale was Alaska. Rewind to 1867. Russia owns a gigantic chunk of frozen North America. About 5 million square kilometers of mountains, forest, and weather that actively wants you dead. Trouble is, it sits on the far side of the entire planet. It's a nightmare to defend, and Russia just got beaten up in the Crimean War and badly needs cash. Worse, they're terrified that if another war kicks off, the British, sitting right next door in Canada, will simply stroll in and take it for free. So Russia makes a very Russian decision. Sell it to the Americans, largely out of spite for Britain. The price? $7.2 million. For the whole thing. That works out to roughly 2 cents an acre. 2 cents. You couldn't buy a sad gas station sandwich today for what Russia charged per acre of a future oil kingdom. The American who signs the deal, Secretary of State William Seward, gets absolutely roasted for it. The newspapers call it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, a giant polar bear garden. Cartoonists draw him lugging home blocks of ice and buckets of snowballs. The national mood is basically, nice work, genius. You bought a walk-in freezer the size of a continent. And then history clears its throat. In 1896, prospectors strike gold in the Klondike, and suddenly Seward's frozen punchline is crawling with people getting rich. Then the 20th century shows up and finds something even better hiding under all that ice. Oil. Oceans of it. Add the fish, the timber, and a front-row military seat pointing straight at Russia during the Cold War, and Seward's icebox turns into one of the smartest purchases any government has ever made. So here's the final scoreboard. Russia sold a strategic, resource-stuffed empire for the price of a used carriage, mostly to annoy the British, and in doing so handed its future rival a treasure chest it is still cashing in today. The land they laughed at now pumps oil, guards a border, and prints money for the other team. Somewhere in the afterlife, a Russian accountant is still screaming into a pillow. and every single Alaskan sunrise makes the scream a little louder. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson had a modest little shopping list. He wanted one city, New Orleans. Whoever controlled that port controlled the Mississippi River, and whoever controlled the Mississippi had a hand wrapped around America's throat. So Jefferson sends his guys to Paris with permission to spend up to $10 million on the city and maybe a bit of swamp around it. Reasonable, focused, small. Then Napoleon flips the entire table. To understand why, you have to look at an island most people forget, Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti. It was the crown jewel of Napoleon's American dream, a sugar machine that printed money. The plan was simple. Crush the slave revolt there, use the island as a base, and turn Louisiana into the breadbasket that feeds the whole operation. One little problem. The Haitians fought like people who had absolutely nothing left to lose, because they didn't. And they had an ally deadlier than any soldier, the mosquito. Yellow fever went through the French troops like a scythe through wheat. Napoleon's own brother-in-law, General Leclerc, shows up with a proud army and a big plan. Yellow Jack buries him and around 50,000 of his men in the Caribbean dirt. The dream rots in the tropical heat. So Napoleon, wounded, broke, and eyeing yet another war with Britain, makes a snap decision that would give any modern real estate agent a heart attack. The Americans came asking about one city? Fine. He'll sell them everything. The entire Louisiana territory. Roughly 828,000 square miles, stretching straight up through the guts of the continent. The Americans, who walked in to buy a single house, get offered the whole neighborhood plus half the county for $15 million. That's about 3 cents an acre. They stood there blinking, said, "Sure?" and doubled the size of the United States with one signature. Napoleon told himself he'd just topped up his war chest and stuck it to the British. What he'd actually done was hand his rival across the ocean the raw material to become a superpower, all because he couldn't beat one stubborn island and a swarm of bugs. The man who wanted to rule the world accidentally built somebody else's. Here's a fact that should keep every history teacher up at night. Decades before Columbus bumped into the Caribbean by accident, China had already built the greatest navy the planet had ever seen, and then set it on fire on purpose. Meet Admiral Zheng, he and the Ming treasure fleet. We're talking hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. A single voyage carried around 28,000 crew across more than 300 vessels. The flagships were floating cities. Even the cautious estimates make them several times the size of anything Columbus would later sail. Put it this way, Columbus's famous Santa Maria was about 85 feet long. Chinese chronicles describe treasure ships that make it look like a bath toy. For nearly 30 years, Zheng, he cruised from China to India to Arabia to the coast of Africa, handing out silk, collecting tribute, and casually bringing home a live giraffe like it was a souvenir keychain. China had the ships, the money, the maps, and a 2-generation head start on the entire age of exploration. The oceans were theirs for the taking. And then the politics changed. Zheng, he died on that final voyage around 1433, and back home, a new wave of Confucian officials looked at these absurdly expensive expeditions and asked the deadliest question in all of government. Why are we spending money on this? To them, the Middle Kingdom already had everything it could possibly need. The outside world was just barbarians and bad ideas. Sailing off to shake its hand was a vanity project, not a strategy. So they didn't just cancel the program. They strangled it in the crib. Ocean-going ships were left to rot or burn to the waterline. Building a big vessel became a crime you could die for. And in the pettiest move of all, they marched into the archives and destroyed the records. The logs, the charts, the hard-won knowledge of half the known world. As if to say, not only are we never doing this again, we're going to make sure you can't even prove we did it once. China closed the door, drew the curtains, and sat down for a few quiet centuries. And while it did, tiny European kingdoms with ships a fraction of the size sailed out and grabbed the planet. The greatest fleet in history didn't sink in a storm or lose a battle. It was executed by its own government for the unforgivable crime of costing too much. Picture the most one-sided staring contest in history. On one side, a tiny alliance of squabbling Greek city-states backs against the wall, their biggest town already in flames. On the other, Xerxes, king of Persia, ruler of the largest empire on earth, commanding a navy of maybe 1,000+ ships. On paper, the Greeks are finished. They know it. Half of them just want to grab their boats and row home to defend their own patches of dirt while they still can. Enter Themistocles, an Athenian general with the soul of a card shark. He can see the obvious. In open water, the Persian fleet will simply swallow the Greeks whole. Numbers win. So he decides not to fight the battle the Persians want. He decides to cheat. He sends a servant, a man named Sisinus, sneaking over to the enemy with a juicy little secret. The message, more or less, psst, the Greeks are panicking. They're going to flee tonight. And honestly, between us, I'd love to switch sides. Move fast and you can trap the lot of them. It's a con. A trap dressed up as a betrayal. And Xerxes, drunk on the smell of total victory, swallows it whole. Overnight, the Persian king orders his enormous fleet to seal off the narrow strait of Salamis and catch the fleeing Greeks. And that is precisely where Themistocles wanted them. Because in that cramped channel, all those Persian ships stop being an armada and become a traffic jam. No room to maneuver, no room to use their numbers. Ships crash into ships. The smaller, heavier Greek triremes ram them at will. The cherry on top. Xerxes had set up a throne on a hillside overlooking the water so he could watch his glorious victory in comfort. Instead, he got a front row seat to a catastrophe, watching hundreds of his own ships turn into splinters while he sat there like a man who paid extra for good seats at the wrong show. The Greeks sank something like 300 enemy vessels and lost only a few dozen of their own. Xerxes packed up and went home. And because one fast-talking Athenian sold a king a lie, he desperately wanted to believe Greek culture survived. The philosophy, the democracy, the whole foundation the West would spend the next 2,000 years bragging about. History's most important victory started with a fake tip and a gullible emperor. Some mistakes blow up in your face. This one blew up in your grandchildren's faces. It's 1917. World War I has turned into a meat grinder, and Germany is fighting on two fronts, which is about as fun as it sounds. The German high command desperately wants Russia out of the war so they can throw everything at the West. And they spot a very useful little troublemaker sitting in exile in Switzerland. A bald, furious revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin, a man who wants to burn the Russian government to the ground and yank Russia straight out of the war. To the Germans, this looks like a gift from heaven. Their logic: smuggle this angry man back into Russia, let him stir up chaos, and watch the Russian war effort rot from the inside. So they arrange a special train to carry Lenin and about 30 fellow revolutionaries across German soil, treating the carriage almost like a sealed package. Do not open, do not inspect, do not let the ideas leak out along the way. They essentially put a revolution in a box and mailed it straight to their enemy's doorstep. Winston Churchill later described it perfectly. The Germans, he said, transported Lenin into Russia like a plague bacillus, a living disease shipped on purpose with a return address. And here's the thing. In the short term, it worked beautifully. Lenin arrives, the Bolsheviks seize power, and Russia signs a humiliating peace deal that drops it right out of the war, exactly as Germany hoped. Mission accomplished. High fives all around in Berlin, except plagues don't check whose side you're on. That temporary chaos hardened into the Soviet Union, a superpower built on the very ideology Germany had just couriered across the continent. And the punchline lands in 1945. The state that Germany accidentally helped birth grows into the Red Army, and that Red Army marches all the way to Berlin and plants its flag on the smoking ruins of the country that thought it was being so clever. Germany wanted to poison one enemy to win one war. Instead, it created a rival that would haunt the whole world for the rest of the century, and personally flatten Berlin within a single lifetime. That's not a boomerang. That's a boomerang with a warhead strapped to it. Imagine dying in a war that's already over. Not about to be over. Over. Signed, sealed, filed away in a drawer. That is the grim comedy of the Battle of New Orleans. Back up. It's the War of 1812. Britain versus the young United States. By late 1814, both sides are exhausted and broke, so their diplomats meet in the Belgian city of Ghent and, on December 24th, 1814, sign a peace treaty. Christmas Eve. The war is done. Handshakes, quills, the whole ceremony. There's just one problem, and it's a very early 1800s kind of problem. News travels by sailing ship. And a sailing ship crossing the winter Atlantic is not exactly a text message. So while that peace treaty is bobbing slowly across the ocean, absolutely nobody in America knows the war is finished. The soldiers down in Louisiana are still very much preparing to kill each other. On January 8th, 1815, more than 2 weeks after peace was signed, a big, confident British army marches on New Orleans. Waiting for them behind a muddy canal is General Andrew Jackson, a lean, permanently furious man defending the city with a gloriously ragtag crew. Regular soldiers, backwoods, frontiersmen, free black militia, native fighters, and even a gang of actual pirates led by the smuggler Jean Lafitte. What follows isn't so much a battle as a slaughter. The British march across open ground straight into Jackson's guns. Their commander, General Pakenham, is cut down by grape shot while trying to rally the advance. When the smoke clears, the British have lost around 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans lose a comically small handful by comparison. It is one of the most lopsided defeats in military history, fought over a war that had already ended weeks before the first shot. The bodies fell for nothing. The treaty didn't care who won that muddy morning. But here's the twist history absolutely loves. Because news of the victory reached the American public at the exact same moment as news of the peace. Everyone simply assumed Andrew Jackson had won the entire war single-handedly. He became a national hero overnight and rode that glory all the way into the White House. A pointless battle and a finished war launched a president. History has a very dark sense of humor. This one is a lesson every business should carve into the wall. Never let your best supplier walk out the door and straight into the arms of the guy trying to kill you. The year is 1453. The city of Constantinople has stood for over 1,000 years behind the most famous walls ever built. The mighty Theodosian land walls, layer upon layer of stone that had shrugged off invader after invader for a full millennium. As long as those walls stood, the last living scrap of the Roman Empire kept breathing. Now meet Orban, a cannon founder from Hungary, and a man with a monster in his head. He's designed an artillery piece unlike anything the world has ever seen. A super cannon, a bombard the size of a small building. Being a reasonable businessman, he first offers it to the defenders. The Byzantine emperor, Constantine, the guy actually standing on those walls. It's the obvious sale. Protect the greatest city on earth with the ultimate wall smasher. But Byzantium is a broke empire running on fumes and faded glory. The emperor can't pay Orban's price and doesn't have the materials to build the thing anyway. So he says no. And Orban, being a professional, shrugs and hauls his world-ending invention to the one customer with an open wallet, Sultan Mehmed II, the young, ambitious Ottoman ruler who happens to be dreaming, at that very moment, about knocking those exact walls flat. Mehmed doesn't just pay. He pays lavishly and gives Orban every scrap of metal and money he asks for. And Orban delivers. The finished cannon is a beast, around 27 feet long, hurling stone balls that weighed over half a ton, capable of throwing them well over a mile. It takes teams of oxen to drag it into position, and it's slow and clumsy and utterly terrifying. But it does the one thing that had been impossible for 1,000 years. It cracks the unbreakable walls of Constantinople open like a hammer through dry plaster. On May 29th, 1453, the city falls. The Byzantine Empire, the last echo of ancient Rome, is gone. Historians literally use this date to mark the end of the Middle Ages. And it all happened because a cash-strapped emperor turned down a salesman who promptly sold the exact weapon of his destruction to his enemy. The customer he couldn't afford became the reason he lost everything. Here's a beautiful piece of irony. A group of men so terrified of losing their country that they personally destroyed it 3 days ahead of schedule. By August 1991, the Soviet Union is wobbling like a drunk on an icy staircase. Reformist leader Mikhail Gorbachev has loosened all the bolts. The republics are itching for independence, and a new treaty is about to hand them serious autonomy. To a circle of communist hardliners, KGB bosses, generals, old guard apparatchiks. This looks like the end of everything sacred. So they decide to save the USSR the good old-fashioned way, with a coup. They call themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, which is roughly as catchy as a tax form. They put Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea, roll tanks into Moscow, and seize the airwaves. And in a detail so perfect you couldn't script it, state television fills the dead air by broadcasting the ballet Swan Lake on a loop. Because nothing says everything is fine, comrade, like hour after hour of pirouetting swans. But these tough guy plotters have one small problem. They are shockingly, hilariously bad at this. At their big press conference, meant to project total iron control, the acting leader, Gennady Yanayev, sits there with his hands visibly shaking, trembling on live television as he tries to explain why democracy has just been canceled. The entire nation watches a man announce he's in charge, while his own body loudly informs everyone that he's petrified. Then comes the image that finishes them off. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, strides out to the crowd defending the parliament building, climbs on top of a tank, one of their tanks, and denounces the coup to the world. The soldiers don't want to fire on their own people. The crowds swell. The plotters lose their nerve. 3 days. That's how long the mighty coup lasts before it collapses in a puddle of shaking hands and ballet music. And here's the kicker. By trying to freeze the Soviet Union solid, they shattered whatever authority it had left. The republics bolted for the exits. Within months, the USSR, the very thing they'd risked everything to save, was formally, legally, permanently dead. They performed emergency surgery to save the patient and accidentally yanked the plug. We like to imagine that the biggest day of the 20th century, D-Day, the invasion that would crack open Hitler's Europe, was decided by steely generals and grand strategy. It wasn't. In the end, it came down to one nervous Scottish weatherman and a gap in the clouds. June 1944. The largest invasion fleet ever assembled is coiled and ready in England. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, all aimed at the beaches of Normandy. But an operation this enormous can't just go whenever it feels like it. It needs a very specific menu of conditions. The right tides to expose the beach obstacles, enough moonlight for the paratroopers, and calm enough seas so the landing craft don't flip over like bath toys. Those windows are rare. Miss one, and you might have to wait weeks for the next. The original date is locked in, June 5th. And then the weather turns absolutely foul. Storms, wind, low cloud. The exact gray soup that could drown the whole invasion before a single boot touches the sand. Standing in the middle of all this is Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, whose job is to tell the most powerful commanders on Earth what the sky is about to do. And Stagg does something genuinely brave. He tells General Eisenhower to stop. Not yet. June 5th is a disaster waiting to happen. So the invasion is postponed, and tens of thousands of men are left seasick and stewing on their ships. Then Stagg spots it. A narrow break, a slim window of workable weather sliding in on June 6th, wedged between two storm systems like one dry moment between two downpours. He carries this fragile little forecast to Eisenhower. And Ike, betting the fate of the free world on one man's read of a barometer, says the most famous plain sentence in military history, "Okay, we'll go, June 6th, they land." And here's what makes it spine-chilling. The Germans, reading the same lousy weather, were certain no sane army would attack in it. Their guard was down. Some of their commanders had even left their posts. Eisenhower himself admitted later that going on the 5th would have been a major disaster. So the hinge of the entire war swung on a weather report. One man looked at the clouds, found a crack of daylight nobody else dared trust, and pointed a whole generation of soldiers through it. No sword, no speech, just a barometer and a very, very good guess. So there it is. Empires won and lost by scissors, mosquitoes, cold feet, and clouds. The people up there making history? Half the time they're just guessing, sweating, and praying nobody notices. Sleep tight. The world's steering wheel has always been a little loose. See you in the next one.